Hello everybody, it's Mobius Y here with another video for Stellaris Console Edition. So this is the second of the three tier lists that I wanted to release, and this one is about Empire Civics. So just like the previous traits tier list, I've listed all the Empire Civics in Stellaris Console Edition based on where I feel they fall due to their overall usefulness and how effective they can be when applied to your empire. It's pretty safe to say that civics are probably the most important selections you'll make when creating your own custom empires, especially when you're min-maxing, as they tend to offer some of the biggest and most unique benefits that you can't get in other aspects of the game. So with that being said, hopefully this video is shorter than the traits tier list, as there were 37 traits that I individually had to rank and discuss why they were ranked there, whereas with the Empire Civics, there's only about 28. There's actually more like about 36 civics in game, but you'll notice that the yellow hive mind civics I put right next to the regular Empire Civics that do the exact same thing. So the hive mind civics are ranked in the same spot as their regular Empire Civics because they essentially do the same thing. So before we really get into this, I would like to take this time to thank Stefan for his help in arranging this tier list with me. He has his own YouTube channel called Stefan Anon. He uploads Stellaris PC content, so he's been releasing a lot of stuff for 2.6 duly regarding Federations, which recently came to PC in about mid-March here. But he does have some great guides for looking up how to play Stellaris 2.2 and how to play it well. He's kind of the go-to channel for me personally when I want to look up how to do good in Stellaris. I cannot recommend his channel enough. I will post a link to his channel in the description below. By all means, please check out his content. Now, just like the traits tier list, there's not going to be any gameplay in this one. I'm just going to be using background images displaying where I have ranked each Empire Civic based on how effective they are. I'll be putting timestamps in the description below if you want to see more information on a specific tier, and there will also be images where I have a big yellow box around the tier that I am discussing to help with navigation as well. So this tier list will actually be coming out after my traits tier list. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend giving it a watch. And if it's not out yet, the Ascension Perks tier list will be coming out very shortly after this one, if it is not already. If it is, I also recommend giving that one a watch, as watching all three can give you a good idea of how to build your empire and how to make them as effective as possible. So, just like with the traits tier list, I have ranked the Empire Civics in 6 tiers: S, A, B, C, D, and F tier. And the civics have been rated based on their overall usefulness throughout the game, whether they get better or worse over time, whether their effects have a significant positive impact on your empire, and how severe the restrictions are to be able to use it. So that's one more thing to consider on top of just your species traits, because civics sometimes do require specific governing ethics or certain types of authority in your government. So the restrictions that certain civics have does play some role in how well they rank, but for the most part it's largely just the positive effects and bonuses you get from having these particular civics selected for your empire. So at S tier, these are essentially the best civics in the game. These are great civic picks regardless of empire build, and that see significant usefulness throughout the game. These are ones that you very much will see a lot of use from the very beginning to the very end of the game, or you will see a lot of use once you reform your government and change your civics to either incorporate these ones in your empire or possibly remove something that's not doing as much or anything for you anymore and adopt these civics instead. A tier is very good civics for any empire regardless of build. These give strong benefits throughout an entire game. They are slightly less useful or positive effects than S tier, which is why they are only in A tier. Nevertheless, they're still really good. You can definitely mix and match civics from the A tier and the S tier together to have really good benefits on your empire's civics. B tier. These are still good civics that are effective for most empire builds. They may lack usefulness for certain Empire setups or stages of the game, or they're just not as effective as A and S tiers. So these can still be good picks that you mix and match with others in B tier or even A or S tier if you are going for some particular Empire builds, but for the most part, you could actually not choose them over A or S tier civics and still do just fine. However, they're not ones to be totally disregarded, as some of them are pretty effective at what they do. C tier. These are mediocre civics that can be used by most Empire builds, but are generally outclassed by civics in B, A, and S tier, either in all stages of the game or overall effectiveness. This tier starts to see the more niche Empire civics fall into this particular category and should largely be avoided. You can still choose them if they have a certain bonus that you're going for, but they're just not as effective either during the entirety of a game or in the bonuses that they give compared to B, A, or S tier civics. D tier. These are bad civics that see use but only for specific niche Empire builds. Beyond that, they're not really useful. They have temporary usefulness only in specific game stages or weak positive effects, or they just might have too many restrictions. So these are civics that you can pretty much almost never pick unless you are, as said, going for specific niche Empire builds or just for fun. F tier. These are bad civics that should never be chosen outside role-playing. They have minimal, zero, or extremely short-term usefulness, and they provide unworthy effects. So these are the civics I never recommend picking unless you are doing it strictly for role-playing reasons, but in terms of actually conjuring up an effective Empire build, I don't think they are worth it whatsoever. So let's get into this. We're going to start from the bottom in F tier, starting with the worst civics and working our way up to S tier, which is the best civics. So in F tier, we're starting off with kind of a dual civic here. We have Citizen Service and its hive mind equivalent Subspace EFAPs. These increase naval capacity by plus 15%, and the Citizen Service requires the militarism ethic with democratic or oligarchic authority, and you cannot be a fanatic xenophile. These are borderline useless civics since naval capacity currently does nothing in Console Edition. They may help stave off attack from hostile AI empires that feel a player is stronger than them due to higher naval capacity, but picking these civics for one specific use is stupid when there are many other civics that can provide more useful benefits throughout an entire game. For example, if you're actually trying to improve your navy and you're already part militarist, you are way better off taking something like Distinguished Admiralty, which actually gives you a good bonus, as opposed to these ones, which literally do nothing because naval capacity is bugged in console version. Never pick these, they are completely useless. Next up, we have Warrior Culture and its hive mind equivalent Strength of Legions. These increase army damage by plus 20% and reduce army upkeep by minus 20%. The Warrior Culture civic requires the militarism ethic. These are good bonuses to an empire's armies. However, army attachments and generals accomplish the same thing without using up a valuable civic slot. I actually dropped this down from C tier. It's pointless to have bonuses for your armies because players can build more armies and army strength matters not when you have a crappy navy. So if you have really powerful armies and you have built a lot of armies, that's all well and good. You're great at invading planets. There's no way that you cannot occupy an enemy planet. But if you have a crappy navy, then your armies are essentially worthless. Also, getting actual bonuses to your armies, especially in your civics, is a bit of a wasted civic slot because there are far better civics that can offer way more significant, far-reaching positive influences than simply increasing the damage that your armies do when they are in combat. Next up, we have Syncretic Evolution. This starts the game with 4 organic pops of a secondary species, not 4 additional pops. They simply replace 4 pops of your native species. You cannot have the Mechanist or Fanatic Purifier civics in order to choose this. So the subservient species is given proles and the strong species traits, which gives significant bonuses to minerals production and a slight increase to food production. However, the overall minerals bonus is equivalent to giving a player's native species the industrious trait, which, if selected, frees up civic slots for much more beneficial options like mining guilds or slaver guilds that provide a bonus throughout the entire empire as opposed to just a single species. Secondary species pops have reduced science output, forcing players to use native species pops for science production, which may not even have a bonus in that field, and more governing ethics attraction, which can make it more difficult for players to shift ethics later in the game. The secondary species also has increased army damage, which is negligible due to many other ways of increasing army damage for any particular species. This civic is also locked in from the start when it's selected and cannot be swapped for other, more beneficial civics later in the game. Due to having 2 pops growing simultaneously on the whole world, players will run into food shortages much faster with this start than normal and be forced to construct a hydroponics farm when they may not have the minerals income to do so right away. So my notes were pretty extensive on this one. Syncretic Evolution is just not a good civic, mostly because it locks you in place. You can't pick something else that improves your production for a particular resource across the Empire, say Unity or minerals. And you can't pick a different civic that gives you better bonuses, for example, ship fire rate, for example, or increasing the army damage of all of your species armies, not just your secondary species that is randomly generated with this Syncretic Evolution civic. It's not a good pick. Use it for role-playing, but outside that, I do not recommend it one bit. And lastly, in F tier, we have the Mechanist Civic. This has you start the game with 4 robot pops, replacing 4 of your regular native species pops, and it reduces the maintenance cost of robots by -5%. This requires the materialism ethic, and you cannot have the Syncretic Evolution Civic. This has similar downsides as Syncretic Evolution, except players will have lower energy production at the start of a game due to robot maintenance. This grants 2 free technologies, powered exoskeletons and robotic workers, which increases minerals output by 5% right at the start of the game because of powered exoskeletons. Mechanist sees improvements over Syncretic Evolution, even though players will be forced to construct an additional power plant sooner than later, but it drops into the same tier due to being unable to swap it out later in the game for a much more useful civic. So this does help you tech up a little bit more quickly in the engineering tree, but not that much. It saves, especially if you're playing a tall empire that is focusing on science, it saves at most maybe 3 or 4 years of additional research. And even for wide empires, it's maybe 6 years of researching technologies that it saves you. So it's not a huge enough bonus getting those 2 techs for free to warrant picking this civic, because again, just like Syncretic Evolution, you can't switch it out for something that is even better later on in the game. So let's move on to the D tier. First up, we have Efficient Bureaucracy and its hive mind equivalent, Divided Attention. These increase your core sector systems by +2. Having one of these can help with early game expansion, but usefulness drops off significantly in the late game as the Administrative Efficiency Repeatable Society tech becomes available. Also, players can resort to using sectors if their empire goes over core sector cap. Being 1 or 2 core sectors over cap is usually not too harmful, provided it is only temporary. Players can construct the base buildings they want on a colony before adding it to a sector, so the sector AI still winds up with a productive colony. There are also technologies and traditions that increase core sector limit in the middle stages of the game. Completing all expansion traditions adds 2, and completing both colonial and galactic bureaucracy add 1 more each. This is not a helpful civic pick, so as my notes said, this one drastically loses its value over time. You're far better off picking up a different civic in the early portions of the game, which is pretty much the only time that a civic like this would be useful to help increase the size that you can expand in the early portions of the game. And really, +2 core sector systems is not very much. If you're playing a science-heavy, taller kind of empire, by the time you get to your repeatables, you'll be able to get 2 copies of Administrative Efficiency, which permanently adds +2 to your core sector systems. You can never lose it, and this civic essentially becomes worthless. Next up in D tier, we have Police State, which decreases unrest by -20, and you cannot be fanatic egalitarian in order to take this civic. Combating unrest is better done by garrisoning armies and increasing happiness. There are also other better methods of decreasing unrest, such as the Greater Good Harmony tradition and the Orbital Mind Control Laser Spaceport module. This civic is best left alone, as there are better options that increase production throughout a player's empire. So reducing unrest might seem useful because you figure, oh, well, I'm going to be using lots of slaves, especially Xeno slaves, once I take over their filthy Xeno capital worlds and that kind of stuff. However, you're taking this civic to simply reduce unrest on a planet when you could be taking a civic such as slaver guilds, that actually increases the production from those slaves. You're far better off increasing production and getting more resources as opposed to reducing unrest. And as said, you can use things like garrisoned armies and the orbital mind control laser and adopting the greater good harmony tradition to reduce unrest on the planet. All of those things combined tends to do a better job than just picking a civic that you would be better off picking something else with. We also have the Philosopher King Civic here in D tier. This increases your ruler skill levels by +2, and it requires a dictatorial or imperial authority. This gives 2 additional leader levels for the ruler, which translates to 6% more unity and -10% influence cost on edicts, which can assist with production a fair margin, especially in the earlier stages of the game. Reducing the cost of powerful edicts like Consecrate World allows for more bonuses to be given to planets in order to speed up colony development, resulting in more production. The reduction in edict cost is not as high as Imperial Cult Civic, however, higher level rulers also increase unity output, which helps players complete traditions more quickly and acquire powerful ascension perks. This usefulness drops off as the game progresses due to bonuses to leader levels from technologies and traditions, such as Polytechnic Education, which helps dictatorial authorities elect higher level leaders into office. Imperial authority is less effective due to predetermined heirs becoming new rulers, and players cannot level up an heir before they take the throne. So I actually dropped this one down from B tier. The extra ruler levels are kinda nice, but not that big of a deal, and they only help your very first ruler in the game. So as stated, 2 extra ruler levels means +6% additional unity production, which is still outclassed by the 3 other civics in the game that produce more unity or have you generate more unity, and it also results in -10% on edict costs, which again is outclassed by another civic that does just that to a higher level. So this civic is essentially not worth it. It only sees use, as said, with the very first leader the very first ruler that takes office at the start of the game. And it requires a dictatorial or imperial authorities, and imperial is probably the worst authority in the game right now, so not worth taking the civic whatsoever. Speaking of Imperial Cult, the next civic in D tier is Imperial Cult. This reduces edict cost by -33%, it requires an authoritarian and spiritualist ethics, and you must have an imperial authority. It helps to decrease the costs of major empire and planetary edicts, such as Encourage Free Thought for faster research speed or Consecrate World. However, high-level rulers serve the same purpose, while increased influence gain also allows more edicts being used, whilst also being available for use elsewhere, such as colonizing, constructing empire-unique buildings, or building megastructures. This civic also has specific requirements for the player in order to be used, which limits its availability and prevents players from using democratic authority. So as said before, you're forced to use the Imperial Authority, which is objectively the worst authority in the game right now, and you have to be a degree of authoritarian and spiritualist. So being authoritarian means that you can have slaves. You're better off checking civics such as slaver guilds since you're part authoritarian, and since you're spiritualist, you do get access to temples, so you could potentially also try to increase your unity output on those temples with another civic, but in order to do that, you have to be a degree of either xenophobe or egalitarian, which you cannot be because you're already authoritarian. So the civic is too restrictive, it doesn't do enough for you. You're better off just taking something like parliamentary system, which increases your gain of influence overall, and that allows you to spread out the use of that influence to more things. Gaining more influence for use on everything is better than reducing the cost of influence on one specific thing. Next up, we have Exalted Priesthood. This increases governing ethics attraction by +20%. It requires a spiritualist ethic and an oligarchic authority. This further increases governing ethics attraction to spiritualism on top of temple buildings, making it more difficult for players to shift away from spiritualism or another governing ethic in order to adopt more useful ethics later in the game. It also restricts players to using the oligarchic authority, which isn't as bad as, say, the imperial authority, but it's not a democratic authority, so it is somewhat limiting. Increasing governing ethics attraction is bad all around because at some point in the game you do want to shift your governing ethics towards something more like militarism to get the better combat bonuses, or towards materialism to get the better research bonuses, what have you. There are certain ethics that you just do not really want to have later on in the game, and having increased governing ethics attraction makes it more difficult to adopt those ethics. Lastly, we have Shadow Council. This reduces election influence cost by minus 50%. It requires the democratic, oligarchic, or dictatorial authority as those three authorities require you to elect a leader into power rather than an heir be appointed. This is not very useful if players don't plan to rig elections the way they want to get the ruler that they want in power. It also only reduces influence cost for one specific use, whereas increased influence generation sees benefit for a number of uses throughout the Empire. So similar to Imperial Cult, this is reducing the influence cost of one specific thing, whereas, like I said before, getting more influence allows you to use more influence for more things across your entire empire. This is not a good civic. I don't recommend picking it pretty much ever. And especially if you're not the kind of person that spends influence to rig elections in order to keep a specific ruler in power that you actually like, because they give good bonuses. Okay, moving on to C tier. First up, we have Environmentalist and the Hive Mind equivalent Ascetic. This decreases consumer goods cost by minus 20%. This stacks well with other reductions in consumer goods cost. However, upon completion of the Harmony tree in-game, players complete 3/4 of the same effect without using up a valuable civic slot. The reduction in minerals being used for pop sustenance is not as substantial as increasing the production of minerals throughout one's empire. So just like with the conservationist trait, this really only reduces the minerals being used to sustain your organic pops by 0.1 per month, which can equate to a fair amount if you have, 300 pops. That could be about 30 minerals per month. However, you could probably get way more minerals per month if you take something like mining guilds or slaver guilds instead, which increases the production of minerals throughout your empire. Not as good as many other civics in higher tiers. You can still pick it if you are really stacking the reductions on consumer goods costs, but I don't necessarily recommend it. Next up, we have Technocracy and the Hive Mind equivalent Natural Neural Network. These increase your research alternatives by +1. The Technocracy civic requires being partially materialist in your ethics. The additional technology options makes it much easier for players to beeline down the tech tree for specific technologies and bonuses. The requirement of being materialist also adds a 5% or 10% bonus to research speed for all branches, increasing the rate at which players will fully research their new technologies. This is not the case for hive minds. Nevertheless, the overall effects of this civic can lead to huge snowballing in the middle stages or later stages of the game due to having completed the more crucial and powerful technologies more quickly than others. Natural Neural Network's only restriction is being a hive mind, making it a contender for S tier. So I dropped these down from A tier. They're only useful for Tech Rush to beeline specific technologies, which is only ever played by tall materialists. That little blurb about the Natural Neural Network being a contender for S tier, again, that is debatable. If you are playing a tall science-focused kind of hive mind, which is a little strange, but totally can be done, this civic does rate somewhat higher, but overall, if you're playing as a tall hive mind, that's kind of a bit beyond the norm, but it can be done. And overall, the Technocracy civic is only being used by tall materialists because you are intentionally trying to get specific technologies in the early and middle stages of the game, which allow you to snowball later on. Other types of empires, you're not really going to be picking this civic as there are better options out there. Next up, we have Nationalistic Zeal. This increases border rage by +10% and increases your maximum allowed rivalries, by +1. It requires the militarism ethic. The increased border rage can help grab more systems producing basic or strategic resources, and an extra rivalry really helps with influence gain. Both effects cause more negative opinion with AI empires, however, due to greater border friction and having 4 rival empires instead of 3. Also, adopting the supremacy traditions and completing the Galactic Ambitions Society technology increases border range very much the same way without using up a valuable civic slot. So if you're stacking border range for the sake of stacking border range, you can definitely pick this one. But there are way better civics out there that increase the amount of resources that your empire can produce, which will give you far more benefits than simply grabbing more systems in your territory. valuable systems that have specific resources you really want to make use of, such as certain high-yield celestial bodies like some asteroids or planets that are generating a lot of resources, and, of course, strategic resources. But to do that, you can just simply build a frontier outpost rather than have bigger borders all around you. Next up, we have Aristocratic Elite. This reduces governor recruitment cost by -50% and increases your Empire leader capacity by +4. In order to choose this civic, you have to have an oligarchic or imperial authority. The increased leader capacity can be nice, but is unlikely to be used for the first portions of a game. Reducing recruitment cost of a single leader type is less beneficial than increasing overall influence generation. Also, this restricts players to an oligarchic or imperial authority. Usefulness of leader capacity drops off severely due to traditions and technologies that increase leader capacity as a game progresses. So, out of the C-tier civics, this is still actually kind of one of the more useful ones, as a much higher Empire leader capacity can result in greater gains. You can have way more scientists in science ships exploring the galaxy in the early portions of the game, completing anomalies, completing special projects, surveying planets for you to colonize or exploit for resources. Higher amounts of generals and admirals if you expect to go to war pretty constantly and split up your large forces of armies and fleets, etc., etc. But as said, leader capacity throughout your empire is increased naturally by completing technologies such as the living state and the collective self, and completing various traditions in the domination tree in particular increases your empire's leader capacity that way as well. Idealistic Foundation. This increases citizen pop happiness by +5%, and it requires the egalitarian ethic. This civic would see the most use in empires that allow slavery, namely authoritarian or xenophobic empires. However, you can't be authoritarian because you have to be some degree of egalitarian. This bonus works on xenoslaves as it applies to all citizens within the Empire, which can combat unrest and increase their production. Happiness bonuses are not as significant as general production bonuses, though. So again, this one is probably one of the more useful C-tier civics if you're partially egalitarian, and you do plan to increase the overall happiness throughout your empire of your native species, or even for xenospecies. You can take this civic, you can increase their living standards, and that might give you some happiness bonuses on top of the various other bonuses being provided by things like species traits. Still not that great of a pick, though. It's for much more niche builds, and that's why it's down in C tier. Okay, moving on up to B tier. First, we have Meritocracy and the Hive Mind equivalent Pooled Knowledge. This increases leader skill levels by +1 and your leader pool size by +1. It requires the democratic or oligarchic authority for the regular Meritocracy civic. This gives players better opportunity to recruit useful, proficient leaders right from the start of the game. Higher level leaders will also provide more bonuses to their effectiveness, most importantly allowing scientists to research higher level anomalies and special projects. It also increases research speed level by 2%. A player's starting governor will also further reduce the cost of clearing tile blockers and increase the construction speed of buildings on the homeworld. Higher level admirals and generals also have more effective fleets and armies during any early wars, which gives players an edge in overall military power. There are slight restrictions in authority types which drop this down from S tier. Note that these restrictions do not apply to a hive mind empire, making pooled knowledge a contender for S tier. So I actually dropped these down from A tier, as leader levels are not as important as resources, and there's no real major benefits in the early game, and the usefulness of this civic drops off hard as you complete technologies that increase your leader pool size, as well as the available leaders you can recruit, as well as completing things like traditions that increase the level that you recruit your leaders at. It's still an alright civic to pick, and doesn't have too many restrictions, which is why it's in B tier. Next up, we have Free Haven, which increases migration attraction by +50%. This requires the Xenophile ethic. This helps players develop new colonies, as xenopops are more likely to migrate to their empire. More pops means more colonies develop faster, which means more production. However, this requires players having migration treaties with other empires to make full use of this civic. And if there are no migration treaties while this civic is active, it is simply taking up a civic slot. It can also lead to many different species pops growing simultaneously on a single colony, which will drastically slow down pop growth speeds for all, or see very slow growth speed for some pops, while the player's native speed species and other citizens have slightly lower than normal growth speeds. It can also have the unintended side effect of having species pops with underwhelming traits inhabiting most of a player's colony. It's not as good as increasing pop growth speed or production values. It gets better over time as players have higher output of food to increase growth speed bonuses throughout the Empire to combat multi-pop growth rates. So, this Civic on its own, it's not terrible. It's just not very good. It's definitely outclassed by several others in even B tier, but by pretty much all the Civics in A and S tier, it's definitely outclassed. However, if you are a degree of Xenophile and plan to adopt lots of Xenos within your Empire, it's not a terrible pick. You'll be having more Xenopops approaching your Empire, allowing you to potentially resettle them onto worlds where they are more useful. Perhaps your native species is better at increased minerals production, and a certain Xenopop that is migrating to your planets and is growing its own pops now is actually better at science. You can resettle them to science worlds to better their science production. Of course, being able to do this does mean that you have to be able to resettle pops at all, which may not be the case depending on your governing ethics. Moving on to Parliamentary System. This increases faction influence gain by plus 50%, and it requires the democratic authority. This can grant major increases in influence gains from happy factions. This civic is often the single highest method of maximizing a player's influence per month. However, the player must actually have happy factions in order for the civic to be taking effect, and it restricts the player to a democratic authority. This is not a huge issue, as it is arguably the best authority in the game, but still a restriction. Inexperienced players who are unfamiliar with the mechanics of factions can possibly get little use from this civic due to repeatedly making game choices that do not please their factions. That last little blurb about inexperienced players probably doesn't apply to people watching this video, as I highly doubt people who are interested in these kind of videos are inexperienced. So, as stated, this civic is the single highest way to increase your influence generation, especially from some very happy factions. I would rate this higher if it didn't require a democratic authority, and if it just simply wasn't as universally helpful as numerous other civics. But I can also see why it would be rated lower, because having this much influence incoming from your factions, as I said, it requires you actually having happy factions. And once you actually do that, though, you can be getting up to, I've had upwards of 14 influence from my factions, from my 2 happy factions. But that required a lot of work going into pleasing them, along with this civic. So it has its use, but it's not as universally beneficial as numerous other civics that are in A tier and S tier. So that's why it is only B tier. So next up, we have Functional Architecture. This reduces the cost of buildings by minus 15%. There's not many methods of decreasing building cost outside of certain rulers and governors having specific leader traits until you get the gravitational analysis repeatable physics technology. Still, however, it is far better to select a civic that increases a player's production of minerals than decrease the cost of minerals of just buildings, as opposed to, increasing the generation of minerals, which is used in building ships, building spaceports, building spaceport modules, building megastructures, not just buildings. As increased resource production can see much greater use in the Empire over cheaper buildings. This was bumped up from C tier. Reduced building costs helps early economy by not spending as many minerals, allowing players to spend them elsewhere. So I did have this ranked lower, but it has no restrictions, and it actually can be somewhat helpful to have for those very beginning stages of the game. If you also get a nice governor with the architectural interest trait, or whatever it's called, that further reduces the cost of buildings, developing your first several colonies could be a lot cheaper than for other empires. Last, in B tier, we have Agrarian Idyll. This causes your hydroponics farms to also produce +1 unity. It requires the pacifist ethic, and you cannot be authoritarian. This is a very good civic for generating additional unity. It combines well with other unity civics such as Inward's Perfection or Beacon of Liberty. Even without additional unity bonuses, a single food-focused world that the player has specialized can easily generate dozens more unity than would be expected with only a monument and a temple building present. The limitations to pacifism knock it down from A tier, but the loss of authoritarianism is not as big an impact due to slaves having huge penalties to unity production. So it's not as universally helpful as, say, Beacon of Liberty. It's not as specifically helpful. It doesn't give as big a specific bonus as Inward Perfection. and you're probably not going to be spamming hydroponics farms as much as possible just to get the bonus unity generation. I don't necessarily recommend that, although, just for fun, you could try that out. But this is still a pretty good civic for helping rush traditions and rush ascension perks, and that is why it is in B tier. Moving right along to A tier, so this is where we start to get into some really good civics. First up, we have Beacon of Liberty and the Hive Mind equivalent, One Mind. Both of these increase monthly unity by plus 15%. Beacon of Liberty requires the egalitarian ethic and democratic authority. You also cannot be xenophobic. This has several restrictions, but still can be combined with agrarian ideal and spiritualism for huge unity gains. The restrictions also force players to use what is arguably the best authority and an ethic that not only creates an easy-to-please faction, but causes a lot of AI empires to have a higher opinion of the player, which can lead to more research agreements, defensive pacts, etc. So basically just improves diplomacy with other partially egalitarian empires. It's not as big an overall bonus as Inward Perfection, however the constraints and negative effects of Inward Perfection's ethics are more restrictive to a player, as pacifism doesn't allow wars of aggression, and xenophobia causes lowered opinion from AI, etc., etc. So this is a really good civic to have if you are partially egalitarian, and definitely if you're going for the democratic authority, which I do recommend. It really helps you complete those tradition trees to get your ascension perks quickly, especially in the early portions of the game, and you can even combine it with a degree of spiritualism to also be able to build temple buildings, which, as said, can produce a decent amount of unity. You can also combine it with some pacifism to take the agrarian ideal perk, and having Beacon of Liberty plus agrarian ideal means your pops that are on hydroponics farms are generating at least 1.15 unity per farm. So moving right along, we have Inward Perfection. This increases monthly unity by plus 30%. It requires pacifism and xenophobic ethics. This gives you a significant bonus to unity production, allowing players to rush traditions and ascension perks quite quickly. It's not as effective alone as other specific unity-focused Empire builds, but it still provides the single highest bonus to the resource production out of all available civics. The limitations to xenophobia and pacifism knock it down from S tier. I actually bumped this up from B tier because despite its restrictions, the flat unity bonus is the biggest in the game. The drawbacks of taking this civic is you have to be partially xenophobic, which means that AI empires will have a lower opinion of you, and you have to be some degree of pacifism, meaning you cannot go on wars of conquest. They can only be at best liberation wars and at worst defensive wars when somebody else declares war on you because for some reason they hate all this pacifism, they hate all this inward perfection that you're going for, so you have to defend yourself. Next up, we have Corporate Dominion. This increases energy generation throughout the Empire by plus 15%. It requires the oligarchic authority, and you cannot be xenophobic. This is a decent bonus to energy production in the Empire, regardless what types of pops are working power plants and other energy-producing buildings. Higher energy output means bigger fleets for more military power, more robots for more production, and more purchases from the curators and artisan troop. Restrictions to authority and ethics knock this down from S tier, so this is still a really good civic, as it's a universal production bonus to your energy, nailing your power plants throughout the entire Empire. The restrictions are not that bad. Oligarchic is still a pretty decent authority, as you have a small pool of leaders that can be elected into office and begin ruling your empire. The only other restriction is you can't be xenophobic, which isn't that big of a deal. So yeah, it's a good civic to pick if you meet the requirements. Last, we have Slaver Guilds. This increases slave minerals output by plus 10% and slave food output by plus 10%. It requires the authoritarian ethic. This provides decent bonuses to minerals and food production from pops that already have bonuses to minerals and food production, which can stack even more with slave processing plant buildings and mining guild civics, and additional traits that increase food and or minerals production. The only downside is players must be authoritarian to use this civic, which is a minor restriction as using slaves requires authoritarian or xenophobic governing ethics. So you can be even authoritarian and xenophobic and use this civic to increase the production from those laborious, filthy xenos that are working your mines and your farms, which can translate to huge amounts of production in terms of both food and minerals. A good civic to pick for slaver empires. I highly recommend it. Last, we have the S-tier civics. These are the creme de la creme, the best of the best, and that is why they are S-tier. Starting off, we have the wombo combo of Fanatic Purifiers and the Hive Mind Devouring Swarm. These civics both do a lot of stuff for you. I'm not going to bother listing all of them here. These civics give massive bonuses to army damage and 0 additional cost to traditions from Xeno slaves for both civics. Fanatic Purifiers can still use Xeno pops for processing, just like the Devouring Swarm. Players who seed multiple worlds from AI empires or invade primitive worlds with high pop counts will see massive jumps in food production this way, leading to colonies developing extremely quickly. The Devouring Swarm gets bonus research speed to biology technologies, mostly in the Society tree, and Society research from consuming Xeno pops. The Fanatic Purifiers gain Unity for purging Xeno pops, which can result in traditions being completed fairly quickly. The bonus plus 33% fire rate for Fanatic Purifiers and the 0.5% hull regen for the Devouring Swarm gives significant advantages over other empires in space combat, as other empires might not benefit from any hull regen or likely have much lower fire rate bonuses. Using Fanatic Purifiers is limited due to ethics restrictions, but the huge amount of bonuses that comes with it makes it extremely powerful. As of now, both civics in Console Edition can be switched in or out of a player's selected civics at any time when playing a Hive Mind, or when the player shifts their ethics to the appropriate requirements. Players can start off as a fanatic xenophobe and pacifist, but change to militarism or spiritualism and adopt Fanatic Purifiers for its combat bonuses. The only downside to both civics is the inability to engage in diplomacy, meaning no deals with traitor enclaves, assistance from the curators, or bonuses from the artisan troop. I didn't mention it, but this also gives you a huge negative opinion from the rest of the galaxy. They will have minus 1,000 opinion towards you, just for having these civics in your empire. So as said, overall, these two civics are probably the two best in the game right now. They are fantastic. If you start off early on as a Hive Mind and you have different civics to improve your overall production and expansion in the early portions of the game, you can switch to a Devouring Swarm at any point when you want to go on Wars of Conquest and eat those filthy Xenos to crank up your pop growth speeds. Eating Xeno pops, especially on planets, if you see either a lot of planets or a few planets that have a lot of pops, it can crank your food production values in the hundreds, which will give you a massive pop growth speed bonus. The same can happen for Fanatic Purifiers. By default, filthy Xeno scum are forced labor to death. So they're not processed for food, meaning that they should have production bonuses to being put in things like mining networks. But you can process them for food just like you can with the Devouring Swarm, which again drastically increases the pop growth speeds of your native pops. There's also innumerable combat bonuses from these two civics, namely from Fanatic Purifiers with that plus 33% fire rate damage bonus. Fire rate bonus, I should say. That combined with a high-level Admiral plus Distinguished Admiralty plus partial militarism means you can get your fire rate way up there. And all your ship's weapons are shooting twice as fast as your enemy's weapons. These are great civics. I highly recommend playing games with these civics. It's very fun, and they are very effective. Next up, we have Cutthroat Politics and its Hive Mind equivalent, Subsumed Will. This increases your monthly influence by +1 each month. These are the best civics for increasing influence generation due to their lack of restrictions and always being active, unlike Parliamentary System, which requires happy factions. More influence overall is superior to reducing influence costs for specific actions, as higher influence generation means doing more of everything that requires a cost of influence to begin with. Hive Minds already have +1 influence generation, so Subsumed Will simply adds more to that bonus for free. So yes, taking Subsumed Will on a Hive Mind essentially means you're getting an extra +2 influence compared to other empires, which can be quite huge. Cutthroat Politics increases it by +1, meaning that you are generating more influence to use for whatever you need them for. Building frontier outposts, colonizing new worlds, building empire-unique buildings, enacting edicts, what have you. These are very good civics, and due to Cutthroat Politics having 0 restrictions, you can use it at any time. I highly recommend it. Next up, second to last, we have mining guilds. We're almost done there, folks. This increases Empire's mineral production by plus 10%. There are 0 requirements for a boost in minerals production, which makes this Civic one of the best picks for a player at any stage of the game in any Empire build. It stacks well with slaver guilds and species traits that also increase minerals production. Minerals wind up being one of the 2 determining factors in the size of a player's fleet by the middle and late stages of the game, and it is the biggest restriction in the early portion of the game to a Empire's expansion. Increasing minerals output means players can build more ships more often, either to build up their fleet before a war or to replace losses from major battles. So, pretty self-explanatory. More minerals is good. Minerals are probably the most important resource from the beginning to the end of the game, if not one of the most important resources out of the 7 that are available. Even if you are falling behind on technology, you can still be generating more minerals and still build more ships that thus have a bigger and stronger fleet than those who have better technology, better weapons than you. You can also be expanding faster than those who do not have as much minerals generation, meaning you can further increase your production over other empires and just snowball really hard from there. Now, last up, we have Distinguished Admiralty. This increases your fire rate by plus 8%, and it requires the militarism ethic. A minor restriction that ultimately results in at least an 18% bonus to fire rate due to militarism, also adding plus 10%. Fire rate bonuses can be the sole factor that determines a player's defeat or overwhelming victory during a space battle. Players can opt for 18% bonus fire rate with this Civic and militarism, 28% with this Civic and fanatic militarism, or 51% with this Civic and militarism plus the fanatic purifier Civic. None of this takes into account fire rate bonuses from admirals, which can push the bonus even further, as well as completing the supremacy traditions. This is a powerful Civic in its own right. Fire rate bonuses are sorely underrated, I feel. Having your ships shoot faster than enemy ships can be even more significant than simply having your ships do more damage or have more hull points than enemy ships. If your weapons are firing twice as fast as theirs, that means that you will have more alpha strikes, more alpha volleys from your fleets than their fleets will, meaning you will do more damage, you will destroy more of their ships before the gaps close and short-range weapons come online, which just leads to your fleet battle snowballing into an overwhelming victory for you. This is a fantastic Civic. It only requires militarism, which is a very small price to pay, and that is why this Civic is S tier. And that'll sum it up for the console Empire Civics tier list. This one was a little bit shorter than the traits tier list, but not by much, only a few minutes. Nevertheless, it was still a pretty long one. And I thank each and every one of you for watching this. I really hope that you learned something. And once again, I want to thank Stefan Anon for helping me out with arranging these tier lists and overviewing them with me before making these videos. If you would like to check out the other tier lists, if they're public now, I highly recommend doing it. If the Ascension Perks one isn't out yet, that's fine. Be patient. It will be out in the next day or two. And I already have the traits tier list, the species traits tier list public. So go give that one a watch as well if you haven't already. Also, check out my other playlists. This one is in the Stellaris Mechanics playlist. Good videos to learn how to get better at the game. There's also Let's Play Stellaris Console Edition, where you can watch me playing. Those are mostly videos from my streams. And, of course, the Stellaris Console Tips and Strategies videos, which can also help you learn how to play the game. So, please check out the links in the description below. Not just Stefan Anon's channel, but also the link to my Twitch channel, where I stream Stellaris Console at least once per week, typically on Tuesdays. My Twitter feed, which is a great way to keep in touch with me. Give me a follow. I'll post important announcements, such as postponing or canceling streams. And, of course, my Discord channel, where a lot of my viewers are currently a part of, and you can discuss with them aspects of Stellaris Console Edition, or even set up multiplayer games, as we have people from both Xbox One and PS4 platforms. Once again, thank you very much for watching this video. This is Mobius Y talking about Stellaris Console Edition, signing off for now.